Oh, worked? Nice. Oh, okay.
Okay, so this is you, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and then when you press it, it'll be for you, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So okay, so the last time we spoke, we talked about your story, and I'll invite you to tell your story.
Mhm.
And we also talked about the Eastern culture where children get hit. Remember, you said you wanted to bring that
Mm,
up?
yeah. Oh,
S-
man, we're going there. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, we have to.
Let's do it.
So, um, and then I looked at your website. You said you have a philosophy of Ubuntu. I'll ask you to explain what is Ubuntu because I would like to know
Mm,
too.
okay.
Um, Then I'll ask you about what was the long-term impact on you from getting hit by your parents during childhood?
Mm,
What
yeah.
was the turning point for you when you felt that you needed to forgive your dad?
Mm,
And
okay.
ancestral trauma, we can talk a little bit about ancestral trauma.
Mm,
So I know that we all carry ancestral trauma, in some shape or form. So
yeah.
I'll just ask you to share from your perspective, what are some recommendations or techniques that we can use to assist in the ancestral trauma healing.
Mm, okay.
And then I know that you also have a group of a community of men, right? And I'll
Mm,
ask you, like, what trends are you seeing in the men that you work with?
okay.
Like encouraging trends or maybe even some troubling trends.
Mm,
Just I'm not gonna put too much pressure on you. It's more like, a conversation, but I'm just letting you know
yeah.
what thoughts I have in my mind. And then
Okay.
we'll talk when we have time, we'll talk about the landmark community.
Oh, yeah. Sweet. A lot of good topics here.
Okay. So let me drink some water.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I see your post on
Oh,
LinkedIn and your consistency. So just
yeah.
I know it's not easy, but I'm glad
Ex-
it's fun.
Thank you. Thank you for your support, I have to say, for being a guest. And I, I kind of just let it be. I just put it out into the universe, and I've been getting a lot of people, and I'm kind of like have a buffer until like end of this year.
Hmm. Yeah.
so so I'm good. I think I'm being guided and supported, I think.
Hmm. Beautiful.
Okay, here we go. I will start talking in a minute so that when I start, I can do my editing. Okay, here we go. Welcome to the Resiliency of the Human Spirit podcast, where we share all about human triumphs for the collective's healing and empowerment. I am your host, Priscilla Hanley. My guest today is Davidson Hang. Davidson's early years were marked by financial hardships and a deep-seated quest for belonging and self-worth. From the struggles of growing up poor to the personal turmoil of his parents' separation, he learned the importance of perseverance and self acceptance. Today, Davidson is a visionary mentor who guides individuals through their own journeys of self improvement and career advancement using a holistic approach and a philosophy deeply rooted in the concept of Ubuntu. Without further ado, I'm going to bring Davidson on right now. Hey, Davidson.
Hey Priscilla, thank you for the opportunity. What a wonderful introduction. You're very thoughtful and intentional with the words and the language you use. So it shows. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join and hang out with me today. So, we come from similar backgrounds because we are both Asian. I'm from Singapore, and I guess, were you born in Vietnam or were you born here?
No,
Okay,
I was born in the US, but my parents were refugees from the Vietnam War, so that certainly has an impact in like how I grew up and
right.
just the philosophies and discipline and And a lot of my Vietnamese friends also share similar baggage, I guess you can call it.
Okay, so let's get to it. Let's share your story and your baggage.
Yeah.
If
It,
that's comfortable for you.
yeah, of course. So I think like a lot of like Asian Americans, especially Vietnamese people, because a lot of my Vietnamese friends also like didn't have a father growing up most of their lives. Um, I think this took me a while to realize, but I had a story that I wasn't good enough because like my own dad didn't even stick around for it, right? So it was more unconscious, like it was more of like an internal behavior. So I would I think it all started when I was a kid, and so my sister's 2 years younger than me. So I think as an only like when you're only child, and then you're like sharing this attention with this like other sibling, and I think from what everyone tells me, I was too young to remember this, but I always liked to be the center of attention. I was always crying, and every time my dad put me down, um, I would cry. So even when he went to the bathroom, I would like knock on the door. Like, so I guess I had separation anxiety as a little baby from what everyone reminds me every year for some reason, even though I'm 36 now. And so my dad, I think he didn't know because in Vietnamese culture, like in Vietnam, like it's normal to beat your kids, right? If they're doing something bad, they get bad grades or they're not listening, like you hit them. That's just normal, right? So I think in America, like we're a little bit more conscious about like, hey, like that's not okay. Like you should ground them, or there's healthier ways of disciplining your kids. So and I had to go through a lot of therapy. So this is why it's a lot easier for me to talk about this. Whereas like when I'm doing EMDR and things like that, like it certainly doesn't feel like the way I'm saying it almost feels like, oh, it's like whatever, he just, got hit, right? So I do want to preface it by that. And so when I was younger, like he would just beat me with and I was a naughty kid, right? Even objectively speaking, I would say like I'm still like a naughty adult where like I just don't like to listen. Part of it is because my ADHD, I'm diagnosed with ADHD and we have bad impulse control. So if someone's like, don't do that, like we're gonna do it, being like a contrarian. So he and my parents didn't have the best marriage, so they fought a lot, and he went to jail, and they would chase each other around with like knives, and like it just like wasn't like a healthy environment growing up. So every time I was, my well, oh, yeah, any questions so far? I know I'm just like talking a lot.
No, I no, go ahead, please.
Okay.
I'm intrigued.
So when my dad like would hit me, he would use like the clothes hangers, like the plastic clothes hangers, like the colorful ones, and they would just break, like it would just keep breaking. And I guess my mom like didn't want to discipline me in that sense. He'll be like, "Hey, like your son was act," or he would like since I was very careless, I would like lose my uniforms and like my jackets and stuff because everyone wore the same like uniform. So every time I did something bad, like losing my stuff, and because we grew up poor, they'd be like, "Do you not realize like we work really hard? Like I'm, cleaning people's feet, and she does nails for a living.
Right.
Like I'm cleaning people's feet, and like you just feel really guilty, really bad, like as a child, right? But I was just being a kid, like running around the playgrounds, like just not being like as careful. So I would lose a lot of things, and I kept getting beat by my dad, and then he was like Jekyll and Hyde, like he would and this in doing a lot of the work, I was able to like finally have compassion and realize like he was hit by his dad, and his dad was unfaithful and had a lot of mistresses. And I guess back in Vietnam, like it was like more acceptable for men. Like I think in today's society that would be like definitely frowned upon, right? But almost like in that more Asian culture where like the men, more patriotic societies, like men kind of like have more like what to say. But he basically raped my grandma and had like 14 kids with her. So from what I hear, he, you know, forced himself upon. But I don't know, like this is just from what I hear from the aunts and uncles. So when I went through like landmark and this healing journey, I called up like all of my relatives, all of my cousins and aunts, and like what happened? Why is my dad the way he is, and why is he the black sheep of the family? Yeah.
Wow. And so I totally relate, Davidson, because like I said, I grew up in Singapore. I was born and raised in Singapore. So I came from the Asian culture as well. And I got hit too. Like you
Yeah.
talked about the clothes hanger. We in Singapore, we have this specific kind of like a rattan thing, a rattan stick, kind of like this long, and
Wow.
it's called the cane. So, and they actually sell that in shops. It's specifically for parents to go pick it up so they can hit it
What?
with their children. So, like, can you imagine the mindset back then
Yeah.
that they actually sell the tool to hit your child with in the shops? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
So, I want to ask you, in your opinion, why do you think I mean, comparing the Eastern and Western culture, why do you think the Eastern culture is somewhat more prone to physically abuse their children, in your opinion?
Hmm. Well, I think we just do what our parents did, right? So it's just like normal. So I don't think they viewed it as like a bad thing. It was just kind of like, hey, like you're not like you're doing naughty things I don't agree with. Like I'm gonna hit you, you know. So I think in some ways it is normalized in our culture. I think my generation, like my friends are starting to have kids now or have very young kids. They're like between 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. So I noticed like they don't hit, their kids because they were hit, right? So they're like, hey, I remember how traumatizing that was for me. Like, so I think we are in some ways more privileged that we do have like, you know, therapy and like, I have the resources where I can hire coaches and go to all this healing work. Whereas like my family, my parents, like, they're just trying to survive, and in some ways, they're
Mhm.
still just trying to survive, so I just wanna preface that, like, at least my generation, like, for the most part, we do have a lot more, like, resources and so I think because my dad would get hit by his dad, and then, all of his siblings were also got hit, it's just normal, yeah.
Yeah. I actually did some research for our call today because I wanted to see whether children being hit is still prevalent in the Eastern culture.
Mm,
And so this is what I found, excuse me. So I found an article from June 2024, I want to say. No, not June 2024, June 2023, by the
mm,
Swaddle. So I'm going to read this short paragraph. It's kind of disturbing. So,
mm,
while corporal punishment is effectively banned in India, researchers found children were still beaten with sticks, slapped, or had their legs tied to chairs if they didn't finish their homework,
mm,
didn't greet their teachers, weren't well groomed, picked fights, or cheated in class. Teachers also often engage in verbal abuse, such as shouting and intimidation tactics, such as threatening to deliver a blow if the child misbehaved.
mm,
So, this is in India in the school environment.
mm,
So, that was very disturbing to me because I feel like if we abuse children from a young age, the bigger perspective is that we are actually perpetuating violence in our society because
mm,
children will grow up and say, okay, I got hit, so violence is okay.
mm,
That was perpetrated on me because my parents or teachers wanted to get their way. So as I grow up, I can use violence to get my
mm,
way as well. So what are your thoughts on this whole situation about violence on children?
mm. I mean, I'm not gonna lie and say like I'm perfect and I've never raised my voice or screamed or, I think like having compassion for my parents, like they just did the best they could with what they knew, which is like what they knew is like all of their friends, like all my friends, mom's friends are also work at nail salons, also hit their kids and I'm sure they talk about it all the time, like, oh, David was a bad kid, like he blah blah blah, right? So they're all, um, I do think in some ways, like I do think that in Western culture, like this is not okay, and I do actually appreciate that about Western culture, where you can a lot of Eastern, a lot of Asian parents will say, oh, like these kids, like, they have no discipline, like, they talk back to their parents, they do whatever they want, right? And in some ways, I think some middle ground, some balance, right, would be good because I also seen the opposite end where some of my hate to generalize like this, but a lot of my white friends, like, they have a very different relationship with their parents, and they have space that they can talk about things and be vulnerable, and even talk about sex, which as an Asian like I'm sure same in Singapore, like you would never talk about sex with your partner with your parents, like that's like taboo, right?
Right, correct.
But I I think it's it's like hurt people hurt. So I think having compassion because I used to make my dad like the enemy or just anyone that has done any domestic violence as like the enemy, right? But being able to start my own men's group and being doing a lot of men's work with the book I have called Redefining Masculinity, like, I think that men just don't have a safe space to process a lot of these harder emotions. Like, my dad didn't really have anywhere. He probably felt like he had to be like the rock and had to like pay for the mortgage and like a lot of responsibilities. So I think because he didn't have anywhere to process it, he took out the anger on me, right? And luckily my sisters didn't get hit, but afterwards in doing landmark, I asked them about it. They're like, dude, it was traumatizing for us, like just to watch you get hit, you know? And I was like, oh, really? You never told me that. They're like, well, yeah, like I don't know. It's like where it's like a weird topic. Like, how do I even bring that up? So
Right.
yeah.
Wow. So, I want to ask you about your philosophy of Ubuntu. I've never heard of that before. Can you elaborate a little bit further for us?
Yeah, it's an African saying where it's like we are one, like we are all the same. So I do think like everything in the world, like good or bad, from Mother Teresa to Gandhi to Nelson Mandela, like all the good in the world, like I feel universally connected, like that's me as well. Like we're all one. So even like all the things that are projected through my parents that I don't necessarily agree with, like the anger, the criticizing, the perfectionism, or the self like critiquing and being really hard on ourselves and with others, that's also me as well.
Mhm.
So my philosophy around that is like anytime I see someone brilliant, like let's say I see you and I'm like, wow, like amazing healing work, like I really respect what you do and like the consistency and just the courage to have these like more difficult conversations. Like, but that's me as well, right? So everything I say what or whether I label it good or bad is inherently a reflection of myself. So if I'm building people up and I'm acknowledging them and I see them for who they are, that's like one way to look at life. But anytime I'm criticizing someone and I'm like saying like, oh, you know, you need to be more ambitious or you need to, whatever it is, like the stuff, the projections I have onto others, that's my own stuff. Like that has nothing to do with the other person.
Right.
And so that's what I mean by that philosophy.
I resonate with that because we're all intricately connected on a higher level, right?
Yeah.
So I am a reflection of you and you're a reflection of me. We're just, consciousness in different forms, right? Consciousness is the singularity really is the source.
Yeah.
So I really resonate with that. So you talked about having a men's group. So tell us a little bit more about um, your work with men and
Mhm.
what are the trends that you're seeing in
Mhm.
in the community of men,
Yeah.
like troubling trends or encouraging trends. What are you seeing in that
Mm.
community?
Yeah, I started the men's group because like I would go to all these like self-development, like healing started retreats or meditations and all this stuff. And I noticed like the self-development community is like very like a lot more women would be even all the coaching certifications I got, like the EQI and Strengths Finders, Clifton, all all the mat like I've went off the deep end and tried like every self-development program that I was exposed to. It would be like I would say 70% women and 30% men. So I thought that was interesting. I'm like, huh, like why do women want to do more of this healing work and more of this like it seems like more community focused self-development, right? Or there's just more women coaches too, I noticed like in all these certifications for ICF, right, which is the International Coach Federation. So I and I was when I was working at LinkedIn, I was very lucky that LinkedIn invested a lot in like healing work and more consciousness stuff. So I would be part of these, I would have all these coffee chats with men, and like more specifically, even like men of color would feel like we didn't like, especially being Asian, right? Like we never talked about our feelings and emotions with our parents, right? It was more like, here are my grades, blah blah blah. It was very like black or white. It wasn't like, hey, I'm feeling kind of depressed, like I'm not really sure why that is. There wasn't any like so I created a men's group because, well, one out of necessity because I was feeling kind of like lonely because this was like right when the pandemic first started, and I was living in New York City, and as you remember, that was like
Oh, yes.
like the beginning of all this stuff. So I was right thrown in the middle of like all that hecticness, and I just remember feeling like very depressed, and I was like, okay. And then every time similar to, it sounds like you have that energy, but people would always call me and just like kind of tell me about everything. So I was like, huh, like it sounds like a lot of these guys are going through the same things, like insecurities around being a first-time father. Like, am I doing enough? Like, am I I'm working hard to make money, but I feel like I'm not emotionally available with my wife. Like, why is that? So I would create these men's group and facilitate these like conversations of just creating open space for men to talk about like depression and suicide and pretty deep topics like that.
Wow, I love that. That is such profound work because, like you said, men seems to be, I mean, from my perspective as a woman, men seems to be more close up. They're not so willing to share.
Yeah.
So is that changing, do you think, in your group,
Mm.
in your community?
Yeah, you're right. I think trending, especially men of color, are definitely opening up more. I was just at a retreat last weekend, so less than 5 days, a men's retreat. And it was just amazing to see us men like staring into each other's eyes, holding hands and
Oh, wow.
sharing like, hey, what do you, and the prompts were like, what are you most ashamed of? Like, what do you not want the other person sitting across from you to know about you? And we were able to observe each other's hands and just like, just give like, and just speak like just what assumptions do I have based on just reading your hand, looking at your like calluses, looking at your like, so it was just really cool to have that like intimacy with another man because I
Yeah.
think in the past, to your point, like that would hear would be like, that's weird. Like, why are you doing that? But we were able to like sit in the sauna together, like pretty much in our boxers, and we were able to like just be with each other. And it wasn't like weird. It was like actually, because I think the way how most men were before, it's like, oh, like it'd be like, oh, that's gay. Like you shouldn't be doing that, right? Or there has to be like women, like even in the same swimming pool, like, oh, like hanging out with a bunch of dudes in your bathing suit, like that's weird. But it
Yes.
was like it was very cool to be able to have like intimacy with other men and just staring into their eyes and just hearing about their deep dark secrets and creating that safe space of like men feeling like they're not enough, like, oh, I need to make more money. I used to make a lot more money, but then I lost my job and I lost a sense of my purpose and identity because like my kids are relying on me so it's just like really cool to see this because like to your point, like there's not a lot of men that are like openly saying this out like in public.
Yeah, that is so encouraging. I love that. It's really a soul to soul connection, don't you think? When you look at someone's
Mm,
eyes, you're actually looking at their soul.
mm,
That's what I think anyway. So, okay, so you talked about the landmark community. Can
mm.
you elaborate further about the programs and
Yeah.
services that they provide to the collective?
Yeah. I think a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with Landmark. It is I'll just preface by saying it's a very controversial, polarizing community. Either like you love it or you hate it, you know? So that's one of the reasons why I started to create my own, like, because everything, we're always derivatives of the things and experiences that we've had, right? So Landmark was probably the most impactful community that I've been a part of, but I just didn't necessarily agree with the pressuring and like the hard like sales slash marketing tactics that they have. But if
I
you
see.
strip away that, like everything else about the community, I would say it like comes from like a really good intention. So it's a community where and there's like different levels to it, so it depends on like how much healing work you want to do. But the first one is called the Landmark Forum, and that's 36 hours, so six, well, a little bit more, maybe 40 hours from 9 a.m. to like 10 p.m., 3 days in a row. So Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, where you're like really getting out everything, where you're making amends. So the distinctions that they train us on are like the first one's called rackets. So like what rackets are we running with others and ourselves, right? So basically it's like how am I convincing, manipulating others to believe my story? So I mean this is a very extreme example, but like let's say you were like raped or you were domestically abused, right? If I just held on to that and I just think my dad's a horrible person for my whole life, like I'm not gonna be open to like connecting with other men, like even that men's retreat. I would just be like, oh, men are bad, like men are just,
Right.
evil, like they're killers or like serial rapists. Like that's like my mentality, right? So that's a racket that I'm running because like not all men are bad, right? Like there's good
Hmm.
people like myself and people in the men's retreat that are doing like really meaningful work. But if that's my story and I'm buying into that, then like I'm never like my whole life would just be spent hanging out with women and like connecting more with opening up with women and not really sharing myself with men. So that's like one of the exercises that they do in that program.
Wow. And sorry, I forgot to mention where, I mean, how do people sign up for your specific men's community?
Yeah. So people could reach out because I have a sliding scale depending on how much money you're making. So if you're making like, good money and like what I used to make when I was in that corporate environment, but yeah, so usually I'll have a discussion with them to see like which, you know, what so usually like people message me on social media. LinkedIn is probably where I'm the most active, but
Okay.
I'm starting to get it's funny because I get a lot of referrals from the spouses or the partners of the guys that end up coming in because I guess they see how I'm like very open with a lot of my insecurities. So they're just like, oh, you're dealing with some imposter syndrome, like you should talk to Davidson.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll put everything in the show notes. So I wanted to ask you about your turning point, right, with your father. I know when we
Mm,
previously had a conversation, you said you somehow felt that you needed to forgive him at some point. So what was a
mm,
turning point for you when you felt that you had to make changes and needed to forgive your dad?
mm. I think it was just like the amount of like unproductive energy I had in my space. So I think anytime someone mentioned like because you know how like Asian families are always like, oh, you look like your dad, or you remind me of your dad. And then like for me, that's like not a compliment, right? Because I'm like, here, my story was like, oh, my dad's a horrible human being, and he's like owes a lot of people money, and he's like, wasn't present in our life and like just left one day without saying a word. So I would get like super triggered when any relative was like, oh my God, you look so much like your dad, or you're like your dad, you're exactly like your dad. Anytime someone compared me to my dad, I was like, no, like I'm not my dad. So like I just realized like I was just like wasting so much mental energy to try not to be like my dad. But the irony is like we're like you said, we're all each other, right? So it's like I am a byproduct of my dad. So naturally, like I'm gonna have some qualities and characteristics that my dad has. Um, but I think like the turning point was I noticed like I wasn't able to like be fully honest and open with my wife. And I'm like, oh, like why is that? And it's like, oh, because if I don't heal my relationship with my parents, then they're like I'm not gonna be able to have the space to be able or the trust to be able to um be as honest and as like open-hearted with my wife. So I think I did it out of like, hey, I want to have kids one day and like I need to do this healing work or else I'm gonna like not be able to be fully present as a father.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow, I love that. Um, it's like the realization you have that what you witnessed in your childhood, right, with your father and your mom not having a good relationship, and you're just kind of like being the cycle breaker, I guess, which is so
Yeah.
encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly have made mistakes, and like I'm definitely trying my best, right? So there's definitely times where I'm not proud of myself if I've raised my voice with my wife, or you know what I mean? Like certain times when I'm triggered and she's like, "You're exactly like your dad," and then I'm just like, "Oh my God," you know? So I'm not gonna lie and say that I'm perfect, but I definitely try to, even if I do make a mistake, like I'll try to like take 100% responsibility, and even if it takes me time to process it, I'm able to be like, "Hey, like." Like this is my baggage, but when you said I'm like my dad, like that really triggered me. And I
Right.
just want to let you know that like I'm like trying my best, and like, so it's just it's a process. But yeah, I definitely try to have self-awareness so I'm not like projecting my stuff onto my wife or my mom or my sisters or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that because self-awareness is key. I mean, nobody is perfect. We're all trying our best, but
Yeah.
when we slip up, it's good to take responsibility. And that's the
Yeah.
main thing. So
Yeah.
I want to shift now to your business.
Mhm.
Um, Tell us the programs and services that you provide to the collective apart from your men's community. What else
Mm.
do you provide
Yeah.
to the collective?
So stay tuned. It took a lot of like intuitively. I'm like, oh, this feels right. So next week I'm get in the process of launching a course on like how to build authentic relationships and network, so that
Nice.
you have 10 times the amount of opportunities, like just through like putting yourself out there, being courageous and like reaching out to people and just building a stronger ecosystem. So it's
Okay.
like a low ticket, like just $100 course that I think will be like one of my biggest contributions to society, just because like
Oh,
I've
nice.
put a lot of thought and intentionality into that. And then I have a Daring Hearts community mastermind where every week on Mondays we do workshops around like healing stuff. So it's a combination of like I went off the deep end and has spent like $150,000 hiring like 20 different coaches, going to all these, traveling the world, doing all these self-development things. And I'm just taking what I enjoyed about each of it, but putting it in the lens that, or innovating on things that I felt like could have been better, and incorporating more community and more of like consistency over the course of the year. So that's like a mastermind format. And then every other week I'll have people that I deem like experts in certain core pillars that I think will help us be able to live like our truest, most courageous life. So, like Venus would be someone I would have on, for instance, like because she's just so good at like putting herself out there and not caring about what other people think. So I think it would just be
Yeah.
inspirational for her to just share about her journey, and how she deals with like criticism or negative feedback, being like an influencer and getting like thousands of comments sometimes. Yeah.
So for our audience, you want to explain who Venus is?
Yeah, yeah, she's like she designs, so she's a vlogger, and she designs she has videos on pleasure, like orgasm, and she specifically designs like vibrators and sex toys. So she's like a really big influencer in like and she's a feminist as well, so she's all for like female empowerment. But what I appreciate most about her, she does it from a place of like authenticity and less of the sensational, like,
Right.
it's like more from a place of like, how can I be grounded in like my truth, and less about like the pleasure stuff, right? And that's some of it, but it's more of like, hey, me being fully self-expressed.
Wow, that's so cool. I need to go check her out.
Yeah, yeah, she's awesome. I'll definitely connect you.
Wonderful. So, um, you mentioned that you worked at LinkedIn before, right? And I
Mm.
bet you were doing really well at LinkedIn because it's like
Mm.
a really, I mean, it's owned by Microsoft, so
Yeah.
you're doing well. So what made you want to leave corporate and, venture out on your own?
Mm. Yeah. I think, I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, right? I think in just having a little bit more perspective now that I'm a little bit more far removed. Even though this week I was just in the LinkedIn office, I think yesterday actually in the LinkedIn office, was like catching up with some of the Asian ERG leaders just to see if I could do some workshops with them. Um, I think corporate is good at like, what I enjoy most about corporate is you get like the community feel, like when you're in the trenches, like you're working really hard, like building something, you build very deep relationships because it's almost like through suffering, I think we become fonder with each other.
Right.
Like similar, I think you said you're in the military, right? So and
Yeah, I get
it's like
that.
almost like you're in the
In the
common theme.
trenches.
Yeah, like I'm building something, like we're innovating, we're changing the world. Like LinkedIn's mission was to provide economic opportunity for every human being, right? Which is like a very admirable mission. But there's a difference between like the mission and like the reality of the day to day. I think most corporations like of that are big like Microsoft scale, right? Like a multi like $1 trillion company, you're just I feel like sometimes you're just like a cog in the machine, right?
Mhm.
And I was super irreplaceable. Yes, like I contributed a lot in terms of like social impact and like all this good stuff, like helping orphans in Vietnam and building schools in Africa, all these like good things that LinkedIn did. But I think when it came to the actual day-to-day activities, if you take away all the fancy like, meditation retreats and like all this stuff, like the actual what they hired me to do was to like cold call and sell businesses, and bring in revenue for the shareholders, right? For the stock price to go up, right? So I think that's the reality is, the bigger the organization, the more streamlined and more systematized everything is. So, and I felt like I wasn't able to make, I mean, I was impactful, but there's a lot of politics that you have to worry about. And I wanted to be more open about the Asian types of conversations. And um, I felt like the best way I could do it is like not have to worry about the PR teams like messaging me and being saying like, "Hey, you can't be doing that because you're an employee of LinkedIn. Like you can't be saying
Oh,
controversial things like
yes.
that."
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the same with the military too. We can't go on TV and start talking about the military. I
Oh.
mean, yeah, they
Hmm.
don't allow that. So yeah, how can people get in touch with you with in your amazing programs?
Yeah, yeah, I have a Calendly link that will be like a coffee chat because with any community I want to make sure that we have alignment and that there's like a real good intention, so I try to vet out everyone because I'm very careful. But I at the end of the day, like I like to be connected with like heart driven like people that lead with their heart. And um so um a lot of people do reach out to me on social media, but the Calendly is like the best way because then we can have like a more intimate conversation together and get to know each other on to see if it makes sense to work together.
Okay, wonderful. I'll put that in the show notes. Question, I forgot to ask you, do you just specifically work with men or do you work with men and women as well?
Um, yeah, I have some women I work with. I guess because I'm like an Asian male, so it just seems like that's like the easiest, like most a lot of Asian men like really identify with what I'm saying, and then they'll reach out to me. But yeah, I've worked with like I had a client who was like a she's in Singapore.
Oh, wow,
You
cool.
know, yeah, so I do, and then have like one guy who's like Spanish and what so I don't only work with Asian men, but I would say that's like a big bulk of it because I do think a lot of the topics I talk about is like resonates with a lot of Asian men in terms of like the perceived lack of masculinity, right? So a lot of Asian men struggle with the confidence of like, and some of it's just because mainstream media for the longest time portrayed us as like that nerdy, like, like the white guy in a knight in shining armor comes and rescue this like damsel in distress, and some of it they fed it, I'm speaking
Yeah,
to the choir, right? So it's
yeah.
like so we grew up with like a lot of insecurities because of Hollywood portrayed us in a certain way. So other than like Jackie Chan and Jet Li, like there weren't a lot of like role models. But I
Mm-hmm.
do think we've made a lot of progress as a society in America that there is more representation where on Netflix, like there are some Asian guys that are like the lead, that's like the cool guy now, right? So that's cool, but that's only been like the last 2, 3 years. Like that's like a relatively newer thing. But I guess that's why they really resonate with a lot of like my coaching. Yeah.
So I want to ask you, what is the legacy that you would like to leave behind for all of us?
Yeah, I have a movement called the 100 million lives movement, which is why like I think even the $100 like course can have like huge implications because I did this I'm doing this journey where I go up to like 1,000 random people like all over like even when I'm traveling to London or wherever I am and I just like have deep conversations with strangers and just like ask them less of the small talk, but it's like, "Hey, do you have any regrets? Like, what do you enjoy most about life?" And, just having, like, really
Right.
so that's my legacy to show people that you never know who you're gonna meet, and then I'll live stream a lot of these things, so they see me getting rejected from, like, a lot of people, but I hope to inspire people to be able to, like, not be afraid to, like, go out there and do the things that they've been afraid of doing, like, when I went on my 16-day solo road trip, like, I didn't have a job, like, it was right when I finally quit corporate, but I was
Right.
just like, like, this is something that I've been thinking about for years, so, like, why not go out there and do it? So, I hope to be, like, a beacon of inspiration for folks that are afraid to do some of these more difficult things, but just to be able to go out there and take action.
So 16-day road trip, where do you go?
This was so cool how this happened. I leveraged the power of community. I just posted like, "Hey, I think I'm gonna go to these countries," and then Google Map, and then I was like, "Hey, if anyone wants to like meet up, or if you're okay with letting me crash at your place, like let me
Oh,
know." And then
wow.
luckily, like I met all these people that I've never met in person before, or friends of friends that were able to connect me, and then I was able to live like crash at their place and build like really cool relationships with these interesting people. So I did my trail. I live in New Jersey, so I did um, like Boston, like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, like Vermont area, and
Mhm.
then like by the beach near Boston, and then um, Montreal, and then Ottawa, and then Toronto, and then Niagara Falls, and then back down.
Oh,
So it's like,
nice.
yeah, that was
And
fun.
so what insights did you gather from your time with
Mm.
yourself on this 16-day road trip?
Mm. I think I realized, like, in some ways, like, how privileged, like, how lucky I am. Like, yes, I grew up poor and, like, my mom does nails and I had, free lunch, like, growing up, right, because of our low income. But I think I was definitely in, like, my own bubble because, like, when you're in tech, like, you make really good money, like, you have, like, really good benefits, and you just think, like, "Oh, everyone else is making, like, 200, 300, 400K, half a million," right? So you're just like, "Oh." So I think
Right.
just being out there in the world, I was able to, because I went up to a lot of random people, so I realized that like, oh, like how privileged I am. And it just helped ground me to have perspective and just be appreciative that I even have the flexibility to like take 16 days off and do this. So
Yeah.
it just gave me a lot of gratitude and helped me be able to see that I don't like necessarily need to be around people to feel loved, like, I can, if as long as I love myself and I'm, growing every day and I'm being present, that's all that matters.
Yes, I so resonate with that. And for me, the epiphany came to me when I deployed to Afghanistan and I saw how they live and the difficult life that they live, right? And I was so grateful to
Mm,
to be, in America because we have everything. I mean, we really do have a lot. And so when I saw what the people were living with in Afghanistan,
mm,
the lack of resources or lack of food and money,
mm,
it just, really blew my mind. And I know I am so blessed and I continue to be really grateful for my life here in America and for what I have. So
mm.
yeah, I totally resonate with your message. And I've seen you on social media going up to strangers, and in my mind, I was like, wow, you're really brave to do that. But I like it. Sometimes you just see the way people's face light up when you just approach them, right?
Aw, yeah.
Because I mean, you're connecting with another soul, another human.
Mm,
So
yeah.
I like what you're doing. So we have a couple minutes left, and I have a signature closing question here that I ask all my guests. So
Mhm,
here is the question. What is your closing message for humanity to help in our collective healing and
mhm.
empowerment?
Hmm. Yeah, I do think we're all, it's funny because this is like almost oxymoronic because like I do think we're all like very unique in that you were put on earth, like there's only going to be one of you, right? So don't be afraid to put yourself out there. And some people, everyone's different. Some people that might be writing a book or a podcast or YouTube or being like a really good friend or an amazing mother or whatever it is, right? But I do think we all have like a side passion project that we're really, really afraid of doing. So I would say tap into what is it that thing that really scares you, like really, really is like I can't even imagine it. Like being a YouTuber, I never thought I would be a YouTuber. Like I would watch it and I'd be like, how did these people do this? Like, or it's like, don't people get self-conscious, like how they look and but I did it and I'm like, "Whoa, like, it's so cool." Like, the people I've met, like yourself and Venus, I'm like, "This is amazing." So and then the oxymoronic part, it's like, you're not that special as well. Because
Yes.
I do think we all think like, "Oh, like, no one could possibly understand the pain and the suffering that I've gone through. Like, my suffering is so unique." Like, I bet like, everyone thinks that, and I've been guilty of that. I'm like, "Oh, like, people don't know what it's like to be an Asian man where, you're, like, getting scrutinized and people making dick jokes about us," like, just stuff like that, right? And I'm not discrediting that. Yes, I have experienced microaggressions and, borderline racism, right? But I'm not the only person that's going through hardships. So I think like it's like a funny message because it's like do you and like notice and like embrace your uniqueness, but also like don't think that you're the only one that's like going through like sadness or depression or thoughts that you're not good enough.
Yeah, and that's where community plays an important part, right? I
Mm,
mean, when you feel like you're the only one going through, a certain problem or a certain hardship, that's when you get isolated and you get lonely. And I think that's where we have to reach out more when we get that feeling of wanting to be isolated from everybody, because that's not
yeah.
healthy.
Yeah, and we always think we're alone, right? Like I talked to some folks that, have isolated and I get some people like need to recharge, but there's a difference between recharging and just like tuning out like, from life. And that's one of the reasons why I created the men's group and the mastermind because I was like, man, I'm having the same exact conversation with like a lot of different people. Like, huh, like I feel like it would be beneficial for like people just to share and then it's always easier to see ourselves in other people, right? So as they work through their breakthroughs, easier for us to get that versus like, oh, if I just talk about my dad or my mom, like that's too heavy for me. So, but when I see other people work through their stuff with their parents, then it's like, oh, like it is possible to have a good relationship with your mom and your dad despite the incompletions and disagreements and whatnot.
Yes, totally agree. So, Davidson, thank you so much for taking the time to, hang out with me today and for the wisdom and information and knowledge that you shared with us. And thank you again for the profound work that you're doing with men. I really, really, I'm encouraged very much by that.
Mm.
So thank you again for being here and
Yeah,
for
and
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, likewise. I also I love the space that you provide. It's like a quiet confidence, right? Like it sounds like you're not the loudest, like in your face leader, right? But you provide space for people to really feel grounded and connected in who they are and their truth. And I know that takes a lot of work yourself, right? That you've clearly have done, and then also takes a lot of courage to continue on this path and putting yourself out there via the podcast and it's just incredible what you're doing. So thank you for the beautiful work that you're doing as well.
Oh, thank you. That is very heartfelt. Thank you very much. And for everybody who's watching and listening, thank you for your time. And until next time, bye for now. Oops, I gotta, oh.